Let's ring in the new year and ring in a new episode. It's time for Architecture, Coffee, and Ink. Hello, this is Hollywood C, and you're listening to Architecture, Coffee, and Ink, a podcast dedicated to introducing concepts, detailing out designs, and tackling the architecture you might not realize the meaning behind. I'm your hostess, and I am here today to start introducing you to the designs that make you wonder why. So I ask you to brew your coffee, grab your sketchbook and pen, and let's begin. Hello, everyone, and a happy new year, and welcome to another episode. I hope that everyone has had an amazing time, whether you went out and hit the town or whether you stayed snuggled up at home. Me, myself, I just rolled off a plane and rolled straight into the studio. So, we are going to be continuing with our New York City art with today's episode focusing on Governor's Island. I am going to dive straight into this episode. Just remember to always check your sources, check your facts, and most importantly, check me. Now, unlike the other episodes in this arc, this episode really builds from the previous episodes. You can still understand and follow along if this is your first time joining us, but I would strongly encourage you to listen to Hello New York and the Statue of Liberty episodes first, if possible, as we're going to be building off bits and pieces of the previous episodes. Governor's Island is currently a total of 172 acres, or 70 hectares, and firmly located in the New York City borough of Manhattan. Governor's Island is located in New York Harbor just off the Columbia Street waterfront district and a half mile or 0.8 kilometers south of Manhattan Island. It is east of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, and the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel runs just north of the island. It is where the Hudson and the East River meets in the harbor. So, when you are entering the harbor from the Atlantic Ocean, Governor's Island is on the right and the Statue of Liberty will be on the left. I just wanted to give some quick spatial context before diving into the history. Thus far, we have had a pretty broad overview of the history of New York, and this is basically the episode where we refine that. I mentioned that the first known inhabitants of the area were the Lenape tribe. They originally called the island Agnuck and primarily utilized it for its overabundance of natural resources. The name actually roughly translates to Nut Island, which was so named because of the overabundance of nut-producing trees like oaks, chestnut, and hickories. They would use these fruit-producing trees as both a food and lumber source, and would use the island as a base for catching seafood such as shellfish and a fishing camp. And yes, I said fruit, as nuts are technically botanically fruits. There is that biology undergrad for the win. I ran across sources that seemed pretty divided on whether or not this area was a permanent residence for the Lenape, and it seems that overall the census is no. However, that doesn't imply the area wasn't highly utilized and essential. As I mentioned, they were the primary inhabitants until the arrival of the Dutch in 1624. In 1609, Henry Hudson was following the trend of other explorers and attempting to find better passage to Asia, and explored the region. As remember, they didn't exactly have Google Maps at the time and were unaware of the scope and size of North and South America. The Dutch were also exploring and attempting to establish colonies like their other European counterparts. What I didn't mention in the previous episodes is that this event was actually what inadvertently heralded in the creation of New York State, with Governor's Island as the actual birthplace. This first establishment of the New Amsterdam colony was the precursor to New York City. This led to the Dutch arriving in 1624. It was a series of families. Unfortunately, it would only last about a year before they would end up moving from Governor's Island to Manhattan Island, as Manhattan was a much larger and overall better strategic location for the type of animal husbandry, weapons, technology, and resources available to them at the time. However, despite this move, they continued to use the island for its natural resources well beyond that. At this time, the island is actually only 72 acres, and so space was limited. But it was some 13 years after the Dutch first arrived that they ended up purchasing the island from the Lenape. Of course, that's purchased using the loosest definition possible. And given the circumstances, it is very likely that the Lenape wouldn't have thought that they were outright attempting to purchase the land. To them and their beliefs, it is more likely that they would have thought they were trying to pay for the right to use it, more like going into a timeshare. The Governor's Island has the following quote regarding the payment. In effect, it was purchased for, quote, 2 axe heads, a string of beads, and a handful of nails, end quote, in 1637 by Governor Van Twiller. It first appeared on a map in 1639, listed as Van Twiller's personal property. One source I read alleged that he owned it privately for some 5 years, which would have been a bit of a problem as he was operating as the governor on behalf of the Dutch West India Company. While he also brought success to the colony, no one was exactly happy that he was also using the opportunity to amass his own private fortune on the side. He eventually was recalled to the homeland, and the island ended up going to the company. I'm not sure why anyone was exactly surprised to find out that someone who was willing to cheat people on deals for them ended up cheating them. Regardless, once it goes back to the Dutch West India Company, it goes into a period of being a blank slate and little documentation exists. There is archaeological evidence of a windmill and a few other things, which correspond with drawings on the previously mentioned map. Documentation picks back up when the British end up securing the region firmly underneath their domain by 1674 as part of their own colonization effort. A result that would end up with them being able to say, quote, that the sun never set on the British Empire, end quote, as my one history professor often quoted. The British included the island into the New York County underneath the Montgomery Charter, along with the 7th Ward, hence the island is part of the Manhattan Borough. Of course, we need to address the name, because as I mentioned, the original name was Hagna Island. When the Dutch arrived at the island, they named it Noten Eilet in 1624, back when they first erected a fort and sawmill on the island. After this point, I mentioned how the British got a hold of the region, which unfortunately resulted in them mispronouncing the Dutch variation of the name and turning it into Nutten Island. After this, the name changed again with the British, as they declared the island, quote, benefit and accommodation of His Majesty Governors, end quote, according to the Governor's Island website. From what I can tell, this is part of a written statement in 1699, and the island was used as a country home for the British governors until around 1710. In 1710 is when it starts its career as a quarantine and jail, and these very paradoxical uses will be frequently seen throughout the rest of its history, switching between summer homes and jails as needed, though the first time any military establishes a presence there is 1755. Originally, the name was Governor's Island with an apostrophe during the British colonial era, and it wasn't until 1784, at which point it switches to the modern-day spelling without the apostrophe. The island also played a role during the American Revolution. In 1776, the then Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, George Washington, attempted to lead his troops to secure New York in the war. In what would become the Battle of Brooklyn, or the Battle of Long Island, the British would end up defeating the American armies. The British had previously withdrawn to Canada, however, due to this battle, ended up maintaining occupation of NYC throughout the war. The island was part of this battle. To clarify, the Battle of Brooklyn and the Battle of Long Island are actually different names for the same battle. The British would use this as a seat of their power until November 25th, 1783, which is known as Evacuation Day, and was celebrated for roughly a century before the celebration began to decline. Though I did discover several historic tours and events about it that have popped up in the last 20 years. During this war, we also see earthen mounds used on the island as defenses, just like in the Statue of Liberty episode. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, these lasted until the first stirrings of the War of 1812, when the US would again fight against the British, at which point updated forts were built on the island, Ellis, and also Manhattan. Though I very confidently said Fort Williams in the last episode, I actually mentally combined together the names of the 2 fortifications on the island built at this time. They were actually Fort J and Castle Williams, but I guess if you're going to be wrong, at least be confidently wrong. These 2 forts actually become among the largest in the harbor. Fort Jay was erected in 1794 and then refurbished again in 1808. All of this directly on top of the original earthen mounds because while they were outdated, they were admittedly in the best strategic location on the island. Castle Williams was designed and built starting in 1807 and ending in 1811 and is named in honor of Chief Engineer Jonathan Williams of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He was the designer, and beyond that, he developed and elevated the fort designs that was implemented throughout the harbor as part of the Second American System. He is credited by the National Park Service as being the designer of the fort and developer of the, quote, prototype that would make up the rest of the defensive system. We have toyed around with the system throughout all of the episodes in New York City so far, though this is the first time we have actually named the system, since this is the fort that truly started it all. As we discussed, this whole system was intended to protect the harbor and Big Apple from the War of 1812. However, in reality, the majority of the city's involvement was a blockade by the British some miles out. The forts were never really used during this time for that war. They were armed and staffed, but were not part of it. This was just after the island had been transformed by New York City into the care of the federal government. The island was also involved during the American Civil War, as it was used both as a recruitment depot and barracks, as well as prison. This would have supported the Union or Northern troops, and the prisoners would have been Confederate. This lasted until the 1870s, when it was again used as home, particularly for the newly established administration headquarters. They would bring their families with them. Despite this, I do want to point out that it was still being used as a prison throughout this entire time. It was confined to Fort Jay and Castle Williams and was primarily for deserters, but still you have that juxtaposition of quaint island overlooking the skyline and prison. Moving into the early 20th century, the island was actually enlarged using rock, dirt, and debris from the construction of the subways, particularly the Lexington Avenue subway, to the point that by 1912 it reaches the total of 172 acres. This was achieved via the efforts of prisoners from Castle Williams. This means that the original 72 acres had an additional 100 constructed. The island also saw use during the First World War, as it was used for housing, materials, and supplies. As I discussed in the previous episode, a nearby wharf was the biggest ammunition depot, so it makes sense. Altogether, some 30 million square feet were dedicated to war efforts on the island. During World War II, it was used to help with D-Day efforts. Specifically, it was the headquarters for the U.S. First Army and all of their efforts. Since we do have a strong international listener base, for those who aren't familiar, D-Day was the Allied seaborne invasion during World War II. It was codenamed Operation Neptune, and they landed on the Normandy coast, with casualties believed to be around 10,000 for the Allied forces and 9,000 on the Germans, but unfortunately that number varies dramatically between killed, missing, captured, and dead, so all numbers are an estimate. It was after the attack on Pearl Harbor that all construction for military on the island multiplied exponentially, and ferries had to pretty much run all day to accommodate the amount of traffic and day-to-day operations. Army occupation of the island lasted until November 1964, when they finally decided to close all remaining New York posts. However, it was actually immediately transferred over to the U.S. Coast Guard. This day would be called Changeover Day, as the island was technically re-enlisted in the Guard on June 30th, 1966. The Coast Guard remained active on the island for another 30 years, and with their removal, it officially ends around 2 centuries of service, according to the National Park Service. At this point, in 1966, it once again becomes a residential community and social status, with events appearing in the society pages in the papers and becoming an elite community. Now, I am completely aware that for most of our listeners, this isn't a lot of time, but remember that America is only 247 years old as of July 4th, 2023 last year. So this island has served or been involved with America's military operations for most of its short life. The end was brought about by Bill Clinton when he closed the Coast Guard facility in 1997. By this time in the 90s, it was taking some 30 million USD to operate. So once they closed it down, it just sat abandoned. It wasn't until 2003 that the island was sold for exactly $1 USD to the city of New York, with 22 acres being used to create a national monument, possibly 2 years earlier in 2001. The Trust for Governor's Island was created and was to steward and develop the 150 acres into a destination for New York residents, with the 22 acres of the national monument remaining underneath the National Park Service. The goal was to be able to provide residents with the opportunity to access green space. This park was opened in 2005 and transformed into an arts hub. The current island is divided up into two major sections: the National Historic Landmark District and then everything else. The National Historic Landmark District has a series of historical and community structures. Focusing on the modern-day park and grand plan, it really is a dramatic transformation. It was a combination of work from West State, Roger Marvel Architects, Dillard Scofieldo and Renfro, Matthew Nelson Landscape Architects, and Urban Design. It was titled the Governor's Island Park and Public Space Master Plan. The final plan chosen was actually part of a 2006 international design competition, which was then further developed. The plan they worked on covered 87 acres of the island and focused on bringing back some life into part of the National Historic District and basically bringing the whole park into the modern day. There was a new park and public space towards the south, which is a total of 40 acres, and the Great Promenade is 2.2 miles and is the entire exterior of the island. One of my favorite facts is that the design team is said to have spent hundreds of hours watching, observing, and studying the park prior to developing the plans in the hopes of incorporating information like visitor usage and current conditions into the plan. It was divided into phases, but that particular plan was finished in 2016. One of the most iconic aspects of the plan is the development of something called the Hills, which is exactly as the name suggested, a series of highly cultivated hills and paths allowing for a brilliant and complete view of the entire New York Harbor. The four hills are called Outlook Hill, Discovery Hill, Slide Hill, and Grassy Hill. What is so incredible about them is that they are a mixture of fills, both salvaged and clean, and allowed for a more complex plant palette due to the varying conditions of the landscape being created. Additionally, they were able to bring in some 40,000 shrubs, create a hammock grove, and several permanent art installations. Among the current inhabitants of the island is the Arts Center at Governor's Island, which is the first permanent art center on the island. This center focuses on creative experimentation, engagement, and dialogue. It is curated by the LMCC, or Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and while they will have residents and artists working on the island all year round, they have open displays for the public from May to October, during what could be considered the hot or tourist season. In the current day, the island has food trucks, vendors, spas, and more. In 2018, the Collective Retreats created the Collective Governor's Island, some 36 glamping tents, and a new spa. Other efforts taken by the island was a series of efforts for the island to become a zero-waste community. All new vendors have to meet requirements and make pledges to be an active part of the Zero Waste Initiative, which means that they have to limit the type of materials, waste, and the types of silverware, etc. There is 7 miles of bike paths, urban farms, and the future site of a $700 million climate crisis laboratory called the New York Climate Exchange Campus. This is projected to create thousands of jobs on the island and is currently set to open in 2028. This will be designed by SOM, which is Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, in partnership with Stony Brook University. It is projected to be a net zero campus operating as a living laboratory. All the renderings I have found are gleaming structures riddled with plants, curves, and cultivated landscapes. Of course, not everyone is happy with the idea of larger buildings making their way onto the island, especially when it comes with a side of rezoning. The island already has a high school with a focus on marine studies, a jazz festival every year, and several other events, and for many, that's where they would like it to stay. Unfortunately, right now, the park is unable to sustain itself without moving forward with a larger project. Like all parks are designed to hopefully at least break even money-wise. And right now, the city is helping to pay for maintenance. By allowing initiatives like this, they can give back and eventually create a self-sustaining park that is able to generate the funds necessary for maintenance and upkeep. But they are starting off right, with companies dedicated to improving and studying ongoing environmental issues. In this vein, a company called Earth Matter is a non-profit on the island that partners with the Trust for Governor's Island and focuses on composting and waste. The compost generated and collected will eventually be harvested and distributed across the island and throughout the rest of the city for community gardens, flower beds, etc. And speaking of the gardens, like many parks in America, the island is home to a teaching garden and bee sanctuary, which is pretty much where you're always guaranteed to find me when I visit anywhere. If you are interested in checking out these exhibits or visiting any of the island year-round, you should check out their website and calendar of events. There are some ones just available for the Art Center and one that includes all the activities and hours of the park, including times and availabilities for ferries. While overall the park is open 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time every day, it is an island in the middle of the harbor. Weather and bad water conditions can affect your ability to access the park, so please plan accordingly and do your research. Currently, you can access ferries to visit the island from Battery Maritime Building if you want to use the Island Trust services exclusively. At the time of me recording this, the NYC ferry will be temporarily skipping the island due to maintenance, but it is projected to be a short pause. They normally do stop there as well, but I am releasing this episode on the day their project starts. The NYC Ferry is the city's public ferry service, which uses a different website and provider, but either way, there are several options to reach the island. For the Trust ferries, please use the website for the current prices. There are also some ferries at certain times that are free, which you can find by looking online as well. Just make sure to always check the schedule and check the ferries. I will link their website in the show description, but we'll be updating the website with a full list of sources as always, which will have all of the options. And with that, we end our first episode of 2024. And once again, have a happy new year. As always, please rate, review, and subscribe everywhere you get your podcasts from. You can find me on Instagram at Architecture Coffee and Ink, email the show at architecturecoffeeandink@gmail.com, or the blog at architecturecoffeeandink.com. Architecture Coffee and Ink is a Hollywood C Studios LLC production. I'm excited to meet with all my designers, dreamers, and DIY enthusiasts next time. But in the meantime, may your coffee mugs be full and your inkwells never run dry.